Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, sorry about all that blurb. I must say I marvel that so many people are prepared to give up their Friday evening to hear a retired journalist talk about a dead politician. Of course, there's a prevailing view that the only good politicians are dead. Some even believe that about journalists. But since my wife has chosen to be in tonight's audience, I hope you'll allow that some politicians are honourable exceptions to that rule of thumb just mentioned. Meanwhile, I'm comforted to be assured that more than half my audience tonight would not consist of academics. I am not an academic. Sir Thomas Playford was certainly not an academic, and I have not written his biography just for academics. So I feel a little less nervous in the knowledge that at least half of you are people of my own kind. Now, one of the questions asked of me is why I wanted to tackle a biography of Tom Playford when I had just retired from daily journalism. I could answer frivolously and say that since I wrote my first book at the age of 57, I've found that, like sex, writing books is hard to give up once you've started. However, the idea was really put into my head by Dr. John Playford, so well known to most of you, for his major contributions to teaching and to the study of politics and history in South Australia. I was immensely flattered by his approach and immensely attracted to the idea. Throughout my career in journalism, I've been fascinated by the lives of interesting men and women. Except for fiction, I think there are more biographies in my home library than books of any other kind. And I've always loved writing profiles of the great and the near great and trying to catch the essence of their nature and character. So tonight I propose to talk to you about three things. First, the nature of biography, as I see it. Secondly, the nature of the task that confronted me in writing the biography of Sir Thomas Playford. And thirdly, the way in which I chose, partly forced by circumstances, to rely so heavily on oral history for the substance of what I've written. Now first, the nature of biography. We've got to go back to page 1. Bernard Crick, the author of The Life of George Orwell, said once that good biography is rare because it needs an unusual combination of the talents of a scholar with those of a detective sergeant. It can result in a memorial or a panegyric. It can mean a hatchet job. It can mean simply a good read. It can also mean the scholarly, the academic, or the definitive, a mere dull attempt to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, so far as that's possible. To my mind, the anxiety to justify biographical work by presenting its subject in exhaustive and exhausting detail is a mistake. It tends to clutter up the story with unnecessary trivia and to become repetitious and boring. Now, let me make a confession. Professor J.A. Lenose wrote what has been described as the greatest biography in the history of Australian literature, The Life of our second Prime Minister, Alfred Deakin. I remember the eagerness with which I myself embarked on it. But I never finished it. It runs to more than 700 pages, including 40 pages of reference notes, and that's getting on for 300,000 words. And despite my own intense interest in people and politics, I found it too long, too solid to cope with, and I laid it aside. I had a similar problem with Geoffrey Searle's prize-winning biography of General Sir John Monash, which runs to 250,000 words, and would have been longer if Searle had not pruned his original draft by more than 50,000 words. Once again, I'm finding David Marr's 300,000 word biography of Patrick White a pretty tough challenge. I saw it unkindly described the other day as a book everyone is reading, but no one's yet finished. And so I'm apparently not the only one who has difficulty with very long biographies. And yet one of the most enthralling biographies I've read is by the same David Marr, his life of former Attorney General and Chief Justice Sir Garfield Barwick, published about 12 years ago. I couldn't put that one down. Interestingly enough, Barwick withdrew his initial agreement to cooperate with Marr, who then had to finish the book in the face of advice by Barwick to all and sundry not to help the writer. But the undaunted Ma completed the book in not much more than 150,000 words and won the New South Wales Government's annual prize for biography with it, a prize which, in my opinion, he richly deserved. I would also like to stress that, in my opinion, biography, often called the most difficult of the literary arts, is not just another form of history. Certainly the subject must be set against the background of his or her times and the influence that that person has had on events and circumstances during those times. But history should not, in my view, intrude more than necessary. The constant purpose of the biographer must be to illuminate character, style, personality. And that must be achieved by art as well as by laboriously researched detail. I've never forgotten reading when I was young an autobiography called Heart on the Left by a German communist named Leonard Frank. Art, Frank asserted, is omission. And that deserves repeating. Art is omission. Well, I did not learn the lesson well enough in the first biography I wrote in collaboration with Sydney science journalist David Ellard. I was the senior partner and editor of that project, and I accept full responsibility for the fact that one of the relatively few criticisms the book attracted from Australian literary critics was one by Peter Ryan, the then director of Melbourne University Press. In an otherwise approving review in the Melbourne Age, Ryan wrote, "This biography would have been twice as good if half as long." As a journalist, I felt rather ashamed to have attracted that sort of criticism from one of my peers. For the record, Oliphant was about 175,000 words long. Playford runs to between 155 and 160,000 words. So perhaps I've still not sufficiently heeded the advice of Leonard Frank and Peter Ryan. Or of that other fine Australian writer, Edmund Campion, who in 1985 said, "The secret of a good biography is knowing what to cut out." You need a pair of scissors as well as a typewriter. Reviewing a biography of the pioneer anthropologist Baldwin Spencer, Campion added, "It's more than 200,000 words with nearly 1,500 footnotes threaten to crush a reader with the weight of detail. At the end, you're asking not for more, but for mercy." Now, let's get back to Playford. Sir Thomas Playford was a member of the South Australian Parliament for 35 years. For 26 years and 226 days of that time he was Premier, and when he retired in 1968, his premiership had encompassed 1/5 of the entire history of South Australia since its foundation as a British province in 1836. During those 35 years, tens of millions of words were spoken by Playford in Parliament, on public platforms, radio, television. They were recorded and commented on by political supporters and opponents, by journalists, by academic and other writers. How do you set about confining the life of such a man to 155,000 words? Well, might you ask? Playford's contributions to parliamentary questions and debate during 35 years, I estimated approximately 25 million words. Newspaper and media reports and articles probably account for at least another 25 million words, at the very least. The notes on sources at the end of the published biography over there indicate the vast range of other potential sources of information. Books, academic papers and theses, a variety of unpublished research material, journals of politics and history, public libraries, archives, university libraries, the archives of public companies like BHP, Liberal Party records. Look, the list is endless. I began by constructing a research program. Books accumulated on my shelves, files rapidly filled 2 filing cabinets. They included 30 or 40 academic theses by students seeking higher degrees at one or other of the universities or colleges of advanced education. Within 6 months, I felt myself suffocating under a mass of material, most of which was so dreary and so boring to me that I was at the point of abandoning my task. This, I decided, was not the stuff of biography. If it bored me to death, how could I hope to command the attention of readers interested in the life story and the life of Tom Playford? You may consider my reaction proof that if I had so little appreciation of the facts and nature of history, I could hardly be expected to construct a worthwhile portrait of anyone. However, I would say this in self-defence and rather immodestly and perhaps irrelevantly. Although I'm not a university graduate and left school without matriculating at the age of 16, because my mother, a widow, could not afford to send me to the university, I was runner-up in the 1936 intermediate examination honours list to the top student, Kathleen Woodruff, who in due course became Professor of History at the University of New South Wales. So I would claim to have possessed at least some natural aptitude for the study of history and for assessing the relevance of research material. Before my first year of work on Playford had ended, I'd made some firm decisions about how I'd proceed. My biography would be a piece of impressionism. I would select what I judged the most important episodes in and the influences on Playford's life. I would research these in depth. Outside these areas, I would not risk drowning in detail. For example, as Campion, I quote Campion again, said in his book Rock Choppers, people are made by their history and cannot escape it. So the influence of Playford's forebears had to be explored. Of course it did. Here I was lucky because John Playford gave me copies of uncompleted and unpublished memoirs by both Pastor Tom Playford, the founder of the family in South Australia, and by his son, so-called Honest Tom Playford, who was Premier of the state 100 years ago. But it was a shock to me to discover that Honest Tom's grandson, Sir Thomas, had not only never troubled to keep memorabilia of any kind, in fact there was an almost complete absence of personal papers, letters, diaries, memoirs, or other documentation to help illuminate the character, nature, and personality of the private man behind the public figure. Despite his gift of the common touch, his amiability, his love of the company of his fellow man, and his remarkable intelligence, Sir Thomas was an intensely private person. On the title page of this book I've set the words of a Persian tribal leader named Nazir Khan, who several hundred years ago asserted that the secret of power is to carry alone knowledge which others cannot bear. That was the way in which by nature and instinct Playford sought to develop and guard his own power. And of course he was interested in power. So little, however, was he puffed up by pride, real or false, that he left no personal papers when he died. Just think of those immense museums of papers which the presidents of the United States leave behind them. Well, Playford left nothing, virtually nothing. Any papers which may have existed were either destroyed or never assembled and preserved in the first place. When on Ash Wednesday 1983 a bushfire destroyed the Norton Summit property of cousin once removed John Playford, it obliterated priceless private records which Dr. Playford had amassed over many years in order to write a history of the whole Playford family. Relatively little which was directly relevant to Sir Thomas, however, was lost because there was so little in existence to collect. A few letters congratulating him on his election as Premier in 1938 and a bundle of letters he received during the Rupert Mac Stewart case were exceptions to his rule. In several years of research, I came across only 8 letters in Sir Thomas's own handwriting. Just compare that with the 2,500 letters which Lucky David Marr had about Patrick White, and believe it or not, the 70,000 letters in and out which Geoffrey Searle had when he was writing his biography of Sir John Monash. Monash must have believed that his life was going to be of interest to all Australians, and he kept every letter that came into him and copies of every letter that went out. 70,000 letters. Well, I had 8. Except for official letters usually drafted by public servants, the former Premier of South Australia just didn't bother to write them. He kept all he needed to know in his head, and he seemed to want to impart as little as possible of this to others. For all his abundant self-confidence, and as the years went by his increasing arrogance in the use of power, Playford was also a man of remarkable personal humility. He was never tempted by the comforts and luxuries of the prosperous society which he had done so much to create and over which he presided as Premier for so long. He was content to live most of his life in the same humble, modestly furnished home at Norton Summit which he helped to build for his bride in the late 1920s, a home which was serviced only by an outside wooden privy until just before World War II, and which had no inside toilet until after his retirement from Parliament at the age of 72 in 1968. And when he died in 1981, he was still driving the same stock model Holden car which he'd bought second-hand 20 years previously. In the manner of his forebears, he was frugal, he was unacquisitive. And when he retired, as Sir Walter Crocker has pointed out, in a portrait which he published in 1983, Playford returned to his home and orchard not a penny richer in real terms than when he entered public life, and I'll say more about that later. This personal and financial integrity immensely enhanced his authority and his repute in the South Australian community. It helped keep the state and its affairs freer of corruption than in any other in Australia. There was no significant public scandal during his 26-year premiership. Well, we can be nostalgic about that, can't we? Playford's relationships with the Labour Party and the trade union movement were almost as good as those he enjoyed with his own political party and with the leaders of commerce and industry. Indeed, the Premier was perpetually at war with his own political party and with private enterprise over the issue of price control. It was one of the vital ingredients in his recipe for the state's industrial advancement and prosperity. By keeping price control on most items in the statistician's Consumer Price Index, not everyone realised this, his price control was confined largely to items in the Consumer Price Index. He was able to hold wages by this means below the levels of wages in the eastern states. And that in turn meant South Australian industry could export its motor bodies and engines, its white goods, its other products to eastern states markets and sell them successfully without transport costs blunting the edge of our competitiveness. Other major weapons in his armoury were his housing policy and the restraints he imposed on water and electricity costs, and we can be nostalgic about that too. At one period, electricity did not rise in price to the consumer for 11 years in succession, and the housing trust rents were controlled for 15 years in succession. Talking of price control, there's a lovely story which I've included in the book involving the former general manager of, he gave me the story, the former general manager of the South Australian Brewing Company, Ron Aitken. Sir Roland Jacobs received a telephone call from Playford in 1963, only a couple of years before he was defeated. He'd had price control on for half a lifetime. And he told Sir Roland that if he cared to bring his general manager with him and meet at the Treasury on Tuesday, he'd have some interesting news. So Jacobs and Aitken presented themselves at the Treasury, and Playford said in his well-known voice, "Well, gentlemen, I've got some good news for you, some good news. The government, meaning me, is going to take price control off beer. There are going to be two conditions, gentlemen, two conditions. First condition is that if and when you gentlemen think the time is right to lift your prices, you first consult me. And the second condition is that if I don't happen to think that the time is propitious, you'll postpone it until I think the time is right." Subject to that, gentlemen, we're taking price control off beer. Oh boy. I said a little while ago Playford's relations with the Labour Party and with the trade union movement were almost as good as those he enjoyed with his own party. Indeed, when he died, a former Labour Premier, Des Corcoran, accepted an invitation from the South Australian Police Association to deliver a panegyric on Playford, and Des concluded with these words: "He was the greatest South Australian of my time. He was a statesman, and in the end many people did not know or care to which party he belonged." What a tribute, what a generous tribute from an opponent, albeit one whose personal integrity was also never under challenge. Now, I'm afraid I've allowed myself to stray from my theme of trying to explain how I approached this task. As I've indicated, I found 35 years of parliamentary debates a pretty indigestible pudding. Selected newspaper reports were better, but as we all know, though few journalists admit, the daily paper is an increasingly fallible guide to the enduring truths of history. It's put together, that is the daily paper, under constant pressures of time and space. Mistakes are not always corrected, and the printed record must be relentlessly challenged, checked and rechecked. One great advantage I possessed was that I'd known Playford throughout his long premiership. I'd interviewed him many times, written countless reports and articles about him, and had my own various mistakes, pointed out to me along the way, even though the paper didn't always print them. The libraries were frankly disappointing to me. I was not able to discover in most of them any treasure troves of previously unpublished material. Relatively few politicians have left their personal papers to the Mortlock Library so far. The most potentially interesting of these included those of Sir Lyle McEwen, Playford's long-time Chief Secretary and Minister of Health, his Education Minister, Baden Pattinson, former Speaker Sir Robert Nichols, and the long-serving and controversial independent Tom Stott. Stott's were the most rewarding. I was able to draw on them usefully, and there's some good anecdotes out of those papers. But the others steered clear of commentaries on and disclosures about their former leader. One of its librarians told me that Bar Smith had virtually nothing about Playford. It surprised me. There was similarly negligible material in the National Library in Canberra, though I found worthwhile documents about the struggle to develop the Lee Creek coalfield in federal cabinet papers in the National Archives, released thanks to the 30-year disclosure rule. Another handicap was that relatively few collections of papers which interested me had yet been classified or indexed. An example is the many boxes of records and documents handed over to the Mortlock by General Motors Holden. I felt I had what I needed about Playford and Holden's from other sources, and I shunned the challenge of spending days or even weeks looking for needles in the great haystack of the Holden collection. It remains a tragedy for biographers and historians that our state government cannot finance the employment of more research librarians to classify and catalogue the rich resources presented or bequeathed to the Mortlock in recent years. For a biographer, many theses of postgraduate university students on aspects of the Playford era were another disappointment to me. There was a marked tendency for most of them to take in each other's washing, especially on the subjects of industrialisation and the electoral system, which is usually called the gerrymander or the playmander. I read dozens of these theses, but they added little to my knowledge of Playford's character and style. Sir Walter Crocker was generous enough to give me access to some 30 hours of tape-recorded interviews which he did with Playford just before the former Premier died. These were certainly valuable. So were similar interviews with ABC journalist the late John Temple, Mr. Mel Pratt of the Australian News and Information Bureau, and with Hugh Stretton in his capacity as Deputy Chairman of the South Australian Housing Trust. But after assessing all this material and much more, the notes at the end of the book illustrate the range of it, I reached the very firm conclusion that if a readable biography which brought the subject alive was ever to be completed, it would have to be based largely on the results of personal interviews, such as those by Crocker, Pratt, Temple and Stretton, which I've just mentioned. In other words, it must be largely based on the newly respectable resources of oral history, which have been disparaged for too long. As I say in my preface, people's reminiscences many years after the events on which they're based can sometimes be unreliable. The temptation to embroider and the instinct to suppress or dilute unpalatable truths represent the thin ice on which every historian and biographer must tread warily. And yet why should the written memoirs of the elderly, or the instant reports and commentaries of newspaper journalism, or the retrospective reflections and insights of academics be automatically judged more reliable than the resources of oral history? News reports, letters, official memoranda, even parliamentary speeches are all too often either deliberately or carelessly misleading, or concerned only to expound one point of view. So the greater part of the research on which the Playford biography is based consists of personal interviews with some 200 men and women who knew the man well from the days of his childhood, throughout his public career and in the last years of his life. Apart from my own recollections, these interviews were what gradually recreated for me the real three-dimensional Playford as he was known to his family, his friends, his political colleagues, his opponents, his critics, his enemies, his leading public servants. My great good fortune was that so many of these people were open and frank with me. For fear of losing them, I began by seeking out those who were the oldest. I had many hours of marvellous talks with the late Sir Fred Drew, Playford's right-hand under-treasurer for 19 years, the late Leslie Hunkin, former Public Service Commissioner, on the eve of his 100th birthday. I even attended his 100th birthday lunch at the Feathers Hotel, and he lived to 102. Marvellous man. He was a Labour man, by the way, in Parliament early in his career. With his successor, Gilbert Seaman, still with us in retirement. With the late Supreme Court, these are my interviews, the late Supreme Court Judge Sir Roderick Chamberlain, with one of the last surviving premiers of the Playford era, Sir Henry Bolte, who died only a few months ago, I think last year was it? I'm not sure. With the late Doreen Dunn, Sir Thomas's former secretary, with the late Lady Playford, the late Sir Lyle McKeown, and with one of the key power brokers of the Playford era, the late Sir Arthur Rymel. People like that, all of whom, except Gilbert Seaman, are now gone. Sir Thomas's younger sister Erica, also now dead, was an invaluable and amazingly frank source of insights into her brother. My brother, she told me, in that wonderful sing-song voice of the Playfords, my brother was a Jekyll and Hyde. He presented one face to his family, one to his parliamentary colleagues, one to the public, and when I know you better, Mr. Cockburn, I may tell you more. She told me quite a lot, actually, but alas, she died before she knew me well enough, I suspect, to tell me everything. I spent time in Canberra talking to the still surviving top public servants who helped run Australia during the Menzies Playford era, men like Nugget Coombs, Governor of the Reserve Bank, Sir Roland Wilson, Secretary of the Treasury, they're still alive, both of them, Sir Fred Wheeler, so's he, Wilson's successor at the Treasury. Men I knew well when I worked for R.G. Menzies in the 50s and who were relaxed and anxious to help when I met them again. They and most of the others I've mentioned in my acknowledgements nearly all liked and admired Playford and had special and affectionate anecdotal recollections which helped bring him back to life, for them, for me, and I hope for you. You know, writing profiles or biographies of people is not much different, I think, from painting their portraits or sculpting their busts or statues. In the latter case, the artist is watching and listening all the time for gestures, responses, characteristic tilts of the head, expressions of the hands, the eyes, the lips, the changing lines of the face as they soften with a smile or harden in different moods. The writer who's drawing a profile is similarly watchful for incidents, moods, anecdotes, insights, which will clothe the skeleton with flesh and somehow imbue the man or woman he's writing about with personality, character, and spirit. And always is the challenge to get at the essence of the person you're studying, and if necessary to summarise a couple of hours of conversation in 200 or 300 words, because, can I repeat it, art is omission, though not, I hope, distortion. Here, for example, is how I summarise one of several 2-hour interviews with Gilbert Seaman, which I subsequently had checked and approved by him as a summary. Playford, said Seaman, showed his capacity for leadership from the moment he became Premier. Indeed, from the time he became Commissioner for Crown Lands a few months earlier. He caused a minor revolution in the administration of the latter portfolio, doing things which no previous commissioner had been prepared to do. Despite his own origins on the land, he came down heavily on rural people who were not paying their proper dues. He made the defaulters pay up. There's no actual evidence that he'd studied the history of the theory and practice of politics in British countries, but I've always been sure that he had. He could readily quote examples of what had happened in British political history during the previous 100 years or so. He was pretty wise. He understood the function of British parliaments. His extraordinary memory meant that he didn't need to put things in writing, and he tended not to do so. That may have been partly a matter of tactics. It's not always good to put things in writing, especially in politics. If he was briefing you and he had learnt to trust you, he would give general instructions only without going into great detail. A public servant or anyone else who tried to put anything over him would have been very foolish, however. The Premier could and did remember exactly what he'd said, accurately and in detail, many weeks and months later. Sometimes official documents went astray. As often as not, the Premier was able to remember clearly the substance and much of the detail of what they contained. When he wanted information from you, it didn't pay to guess. If you gave him incorrect information, he would be sure to find out. Mind you, Seaman paused then, mind you, he said, he would sometimes do a bit of guessing himself when answering questions in Parliament. Occasionally, when I was under Treasurer, I had to say to him, "You know, Premier, that figure you quoted at question time in answer to Mr. O'Halloran yesterday, it was wrong." And then he might grin and say, "Oh, never mind, Gilbert, who will know?" He was a political villain. I've never known any politician so frugal in the administration of public money. It was part of his nature. He was not interested in making money for himself. He probably carried it a bit far. Until she had a serious illness in the 1950s, he would expect his wife, who had not then learnt to drive a car, to come down to the city from Norton Summit by bus to attend some public function. After he retired, Don Dunstan, then Premier, offered him, as a former Premier of long-standing, a government car and driver. Playford wouldn't have a bar of it. Even when he became a member of the board of the Electricity Trust, he used to drive his old model Holden car down to the city from Norton Summit and home again afterwards. He wouldn't claim expenses for this. When in office, he would rarely claim his full travelling allowance entitlements for interstate or overseas journeys. This stern frugality was known to all public servants and influenced the great majority of them in their attitude to their own work. That reminiscence, it's almost a soliloquy by Gilbert Seaman, is to my mind the very stuff of biography. And it's the sort of thing which provides the most of the substance of Playford benevolent despot. And wherever it seemed to me appropriate, I've included long verbatim quotes like that. Seaman's is just one example. Another comes from Sir Norman Young. Now, how am I going for time? All right? I don't know how you suffer these long talks, but anyway, here we go. Another example comes from Sir Norman Young, prominent accountant and company director of the Playford era, who's recently published, at the age of 80, his own interesting memoirs, who might have been expected by some people to be largely uncritical of Tom Playford, but not so. And here's how I summarise a long interview with Sir Norman. Of course, Playford was such a difficult man to oppose. If his charm didn't work on you, he would resort to bullying. Eventually, he had almost the entire business community under his thumb. Ordinary people were mesmerised by him. I can recall many cases of little people, neighbours, women, contemplating sadly some development about to disturb their domestic peace. It might have been a new factory at the end of their street or the loss of some old established amenity, and they'd say wistfully, "Oh, well, I suppose we've got to have progress." And the march of industry and commerce was identified quite uncritically and automatically in their minds with some theoretical value called progress. There was no effort to try to achieve that progress with the minimum possible disruption of reasonable environmental amenity. With hindsight, of course, it's possible to question the wisdom of having developed so much heavy industry in South Australia, industry whose products had to be transported to distant markets at considerable expense. The long-term disadvantages have tended to outweigh the short-term advantages. Members of the business community in those days were not very sophisticated. Their activities were uncomplicated, their courses of action much more influenced by the past than nowadays. The local business community was not large, relatively speaking. It was dominated by wealthy individuals and family companies rather than wealthy corporations, and they tended to invest already accumulated capital rather than produce new capital. Their preferred investments were shares, property, land. Another reason why Playford was able to exercise such a profound influence over business and industry during the post-war period was that during the war itself, the whole community had come to accept government intervention in almost every aspect of their lives. It was therefore easier than before for even a non-Labour Premier to go on intervening when he thought it appropriate. Playford thought controls helped the community. He never had the instincts of a capitalist, and he therefore never wanted to get rid of post-war controls to please business. The controls he continued to exercise were not politically unpopular with the mass of voters. They enabled him to govern more conveniently, and the forces of capital were not strong enough to make him dismantle them. He achieved his purpose by the force of his personality, the quality of his mind, and the relentlessness of his will. Well, I found that fascinating, especially coming from Sir Norman Young, who is one of the most prominent company directors of his time, who was chairman of the Bank of Adelaide, chairman of News Corporation, chairman of Elder Smiths, until displaced by John Elliott, and so on. I mentioned letters. My search for them was industrious, but largely unrewarding. One of them a mere postcard, actually, I traced to Sir Thomas's first girlfriend, his cousin May Cowling, later May Griggs, whom I happily found still alive in Hughes Street, Northumberland, at the age of 92 in 1986. It was a very formal postcard written from the battlefields of France in World War One. May was still wistful about Tom, but their romance had been nipped in the bud by Tom's masterful mother Bessie, who said, "Cousins don't marry." And that was that. But the visit brought me an interesting fragment of family history. As I was leaving May, she said, "Of course, Mr. Cockburn, you know about Honest Tom's girlfriend," meaning Sir Thomas Playford's grandfather, the first Playford to become Premier of South Australia and later a minister in the second Deakin government at the beginning of the century. "No," I said, I've never heard of Honest Tom's girlfriend." "Well," she told me, "in those days the new Commonwealth Parliament sat in Melbourne, and Honest Tom had to go there by train and stay there for longish periods. He was in his mid-60s, his wife had had 11 children and was in chronic ill health, and in Melbourne he met a married woman named Florrie McQueen. The family were very upset about it. They thought he was going to leave all his money to her." Well, this sounded worth following up, especially in the case of a politician who rejoiced in the politically useful nickname of Honest Tom. So I went down to the probate office of the Supreme Court and I found Honest Tom's will. He died in 1915 and he left Florrie McQueen a house and a life interest in the income from his gas company bonds and debentures. And the family was relieved it wasn't more than that. I quote extracts from the will in the opening chapter of the book. It was interesting because I was able to establish that all four of the succession of Playfords to bear the name Thomas had done a bit of philandering in their time. I was relieved, however, because I wanted to think well of old Tom. I was relieved to satisfy myself Sir Thomas himself was as pure as the driven snow in this respect. If he'd ever been a philanderer, I'm certain I would have discovered the fact in the course of my research. But I'm satisfied he was as loyal to his wife throughout their 53-year marriage as he was honest in financial matters. Indeed, his eldest sister Eleanor, still alive at the age of 98, told me women weren't in my brother's line at all. He never worried much about chasing them. Sir Thomas died at the age of 84. Now that's important. And one of the anecdotes I enjoyed most came from his 98-year-old sister Eleanor, who told me a couple of years ago, "You might be interested, Mr. Cockburn, to know that what my brother had for breakfast. All his life, he always had the same breakfast. He would take a thick piece of bread and he would butter it thickly, and he would then take 6 pullet's eggs and he would crack them into a pan and he would cook them lightly and dip them onto the bread and butter, and that was his breakfast. He had it all his life, as far as I know. Now, Mr. Cockburn, you and I would know that would have been very bad for his cholesterol. And I'm convinced that that's why he died young." One of the few letters I've seen in Sir Thomas's handwriting makes me miserable that he wrote so few letters. It perfectly illustrates his sense of humour. It was written a few months before he died in 1981, as I said, at the age of 84, to Premier David Tonkin, from whom I got it. Tonkin had had a new state tie designed, and I'm wearing it specially tonight for this occasion. And he sent a sample to Tom Playford, who replied, "Dear David, thank you very much for the tie you've had designed. I like the tie, David, I like the tie, and I'll wear it when I can, though there isn't much demand for ties in the orchard these days. You might be interested to know, David, that a young reporter from the Advertiser has just telephoned me to see if I thought my health had been adversely affected by the atomic bomb test I attended at Maralinga in 1955. I think it was 55. At first I told him no, but then I thought again and said, well, on reflection, perhaps my health was affected. When I went to Maralinga, I had 3 children. And now I come to think of it, I've had no more children since then. So my potency may have been damaged by the fallout. Perhaps I can make a claim on someone, David. Thank you again for the tie. Yours sincerely, Tom Playford." Only 8 letters. Perhaps I should summarise Tom Playford's achievement briefly. During his premiership, South Australia's population almost doubled. While he was Premier, the state's per capita factory production rose in value from the lowest to the second highest in the Commonwealth. In 1 year during the 1950s, 122 new industries established themselves either in Adelaide or in the principal country towns. Some 55,000 houses and flats built by the housing were built by the Housing Trust during the Playford era. More than 1/5 of the entire population of South Australia still lives in those dwellings. At the peak of the Playford heyday, the Commonwealth statistician recorded that out of a population of just under 800,000, I've forgotten the year, I think it was somewhere in the 1950s, I think, South Australia had only 46 persons classified as unemployed. What have we got today? 70, 80,000? I'd like to conclude my talk by saying something more about Playford's personal integrity in financial matters. When he retired, Playford received only the same pension as a backbencher because he'd always resisted moves by other politicians on both sides of the Parliament to provide more generous benefits for premiers and cabinet ministers than for backbenchers. His full retirement pension in 1968 was therefore, 1968, full retirement pension was only $3,744 a year, or $72 a week. When he died 13 years later, in 1981, only 10 years ago, the indexation process had increased that pension to a taxable $11,150 a year, approximately $214.50 a week. And this was appreciably less than the then average weekly ordinary time earnings for an adult male of approximately $14,768 a year, or $284 a week. And lest it be thought that the former Premier was independently rich, it should be stated that when Lady Playford died in 1986, her 3 children inherited between them from her estate and that of their father total assets, including an orchard which was inherited from previous generations of Playfords, worth less than the benefits now enjoyed by any retiring backbench member of Parliament with 20 years' service. 1986 was also a year in which some builders' labourers were taking home nearly $1,000 a week in after-tax earnings during Adelaide's then developing property boom. A retiring Premier who elected to go out on a full pension after 20 years' service in the Parliament would today be entitled to more than $80,000 a year if he had served as Premier for 6 or more years, 20 years fewer than Sir Thomas Playford. A backbench member retiring after 20 years' service would qualify for a pension of around $44,000 a year. The last major upgrading of the parliamentary superannuation scheme was accomplished by legislation introduced in the last year of the Dunstan government in 1978. Sir Thomas's son summed it all up in these words: "My father always said he never went into Parliament for the money. His primary purpose and intention was to serve the people of South Australia. Many of those whom he served became millionaires, but it can be said with certainty the man who helped them make their fortunes neither begrudged nor envied them. He steered by a different star." Now, I'd like to add that before publication, the manuscript of my biography was read in whole or in part, checked, commented on and corrected by nearly 40 men and women most closely associated or familiar with him in his premiership. In their opinion, I've achieved a fair and balanced portrait of the man. And I would like to conclude by again thanking Dr. Playford for his enormous help during the 7 years it took me to complete my task, and for the integrity of that help. Thank you.
Simple question. Was there anyone who refused to speak to you? And if so, do you know why?
It's a good question. You know, it's taken me so long to do this. Nobody significant refused, but I do remember my disappointment with the results of my interview with Sir Lyle McKeown. I knew him pretty well, and I saw him 3 or 4 times, but he would not be pinned down. He wanted to talk about his own experience and term as Minister and Chief Secretary, Minister of Health, and I could not bring him back to Playford. And he would not tell me. I hoped he would tell me a lot of things about what went on in Cabinet. And he wouldn't, and he didn't. He said that was confidential. I said, but fair go, Sir Lyle. In fact, I called him Lyle in the end. He permitted me to do that. Fair go. I said the 30-year rule, it's just about up, and you can talk freely about it. We know what happened in federal cabinet meetings, but he wouldn't. And I don't know why. I think it could have been that he simply didn't remember very much. One of the interesting things about cabinet proceedings in Playford's day was no public servant ever sat in them. Minutes were not taken, and it's a waste of time, you know, going to the Public Records Office and looking at cabinet papers there, because decisions were, or submissions rather, were simply initialed approved TP or refer back to department TP. There was no comment. It was all in the mind of Playford and such of his ministers as could remember what happened. And that was a great disappointment to him, but I don't think anyone refused. Gilbert Seaman, for instance, was immensely helpful to me. And dear old Les Hunkin tried so hard to help me. They were all anxious. My wife's trying to remind me of some... Oh, yes, Dunstan, Don. I don't know whether he's here now. I don't suppose he is. But, of course, Don Dunstan did, years ago, refuse, if he's here, he will know, he refused to help me with the biography of Sir Mark Oliphant, because he was outraged by the Salisbury affair and the way I handled it. And he replied in writing, and it went something like this: Dear Mr. Cockburn, I'm interested in the fact that you're doing a biography of Sir Mark Oliphant, but in view of the lies, distortions, and other excesses which you committed in the Salisbury affair, I could have no faith in your integrity, and therefore I would not be willing to help you with your biography of Oliphant. I can understand his resentment of the Salisbury affair and the way I handled it, but this time I really needed his cooperation. How could I write a credible biography of Tom Playford without an input from Don Dunstan? And I was trying hard to think how I could approach him again. And I ran into Hugh Hudson at Adelaide Airport one day, and I told him about the problem. Oh, he said, Don will see you. He said, I'll give him a ring. And a fortnight or so later, Don rang me and said, Stewart, I'll help you with Playford. And I said, well, that's wonderful. I said, how should we meet? Should I come to your home or you come to mine? No, I'll come and see you. I said, do you want to bring a witness with you? And he said, no, you needn't worry about that. And I said, my shorthand's lousy nowadays. Would you mind if I tape recorded it? He said, no, certainly you can bring a tape recorder. You can use a tape recorder. And he came out and spent nearly 3 hours with me, and I'm immensely grateful to him for doing that. And I think I dealt with him, I think, fairly. And I ruled off when Playford retired. It was before all the other business which arose after Playford's retirement, and I thought I would best deal with that by simply ignoring it. I ruled off with Playford's parliamentary career. So that, yes, even Don Dunstan agreed to see me, and it was very helpful, and it really is very important that he was willing to talk to me about Tom.
One part of his character you didn't like, or was he really
all over Mr. Nice Guy? Oh no, there were aspects of Tom Playford's character which I don't think I liked very much. He was a bully. He was a bully when he didn't get his way. He liked to win. He was a bad loser, and he was a cunning fellow, and
I don't think I'm cunning, and I don't think I like cunning people on the whole. But he had this immense charisma. He was an attractive fellow. He had in so many ways. He had a lovely sense of humour. He didn't abuse his power for personal advantage, except in preserving that power. For instance, in the electoral system, it was unfair in strict terms. Of course, it was, but he believed in it. There's a passage. I wonder if I can find it. I think I can. You know, he really believed that the person who lived in the country deserved a weighted vote, that they were more important, more valuable, better citizens. And the clue to it, I thank you for asking that question, because I would otherwise have forgotten this. Back in 1899, honest Tom Playford, Sir Thomas's grandfather, was speaking on an electoral bill in the then House of Assembly, and he said this: opposing a one vote, one value electoral system in 1899, honest Tom declared they couldn't get away from it. They found the good-for-nothings, ne'er-do-wells, rogues, prostitutes and vagabonds, if they found them anywhere, in the big centres of population. If they were wise in their generation, they would not give them the same representation as perhaps the more wealthy and the more intelligent and honourable people who lived in the country. And I think the grandson had read and absorbed those words, and he genuinely believed. I'm sure even Don Dunstan would agree. He genuinely believed that the person in the country was worth more as a person and as a citizen than those of us who live in the city. Yes.
Stewart, in the course of your work, were you able to get any real feel as to what Playford's personal feelings might have been at significant points in his career, when he entered Parliament, when he became Premier, or when he was finally defeated?
Not very much. And that's one of the, you see, he didn't commit himself to writing on these things. And he wasn't the sort of fellow who liked to discuss his personal feelings. And he didn't do it, to my knowledge, very much. So it's a pretty good question, that. And that's one of the omissions, I suppose, in the book. I can't tell you how he reacted to certain vital moments until we came to the Stewart case, and then we have a bit more idea of how he felt about certain events in his life. I mean, there are fragments along the way, sure, but again, Jennifer's just reminding me. Oh, the night of his defeat, yes, of course, that was right at the end. It might be worth reading that. But they were so few, weren't they? They were so few. Here it is. You remember the final election in 1965, he was defeated. Hugh Hudson beat the incumbent in Glenelg, and Sir Condolauke was, or Condolauke as he then was defeated in Barossa by Molly Byrne, and down came the Playford government. And Tom really had been there so long, and he was so accustomed to his running without challenge, that he hadn't really believed that he would go in 1965. But with exceptional grace, he conceded defeat around midnight, and he told reporters genially, well, that's the way it goes in politics. Frank can take over as soon as he's ready, because it was Frank Walsh, who was the leader of the opposition then. And Playford went to the telephone, rang his former secretary, George Pearce, now Agent General in London, and told him, you're under new management, George. But when he returned home to Norton Summit, he allowed a freer rein to the emotions he'd been holding in check. He went into young Tom's bedroom to break the news to his son, who'd been out with friends and not followed the Count. He had rare tears in his eyes. "We've been beaten," he said simply. He couldn't go on and retired immediately to his own bedroom. Now, a fragment like that, it's important because it's so rare a fragment, I think. But as a matter of fact, it's Jennifer I have to thank for the fact that I remember to put that in the book, because we were having dinner with Tom Playford Jr. one night, and that's when he told us about it. And when I was doing this chapter, I'd drafted it without that anecdote in it, and Jenny reminded me, thank goodness.
Stewart portrays Thomas as a man whose prime concern was the welfare of the people.
Mm.
He also indicated that he enjoyed power. Did he have any particular principles that guided him in determining what the welfare of the people was?
Well, as Edmund Campion said, people are made by their history and cannot escape it. And I spend quite a lot of time revealing, so far as I've been able to ascertain it, the history of the Playford family and the influences which bore on him and his forebears. The community had, as a community, a different philosophy. As an historian, you know so much more about it than I do, and you know the prevailing mores at the time. It was a religious community in those days, prevailingly religious, and people accepted the authority of the churches. Playford, I imagine, was, in fact, I know, was heavily influenced by the religious beliefs of his family. He was brought up in the Baptist church. He had a few reservations about it. I deal with those. But I think you'll have to read it. Perhaps you have already, I don't know. Did I leave unanswered questions? In your mind, probably, I don't know. I'd be very grateful, John, if when you've read it, you would let me know your reservations, because you will have them, I expect, and I would very, very much value your opinion. I find it hard off the cuff to answer that question. It's a penetrating one, and I can't deal with it easily. Well, there are little anecdotes which reveal that he and his elder daughter Margaret didn't always see eye to eye, and Margaret would stand up to him as she was growing up and challenge him on the electoral system, challenge him on smoking, for instance. There was one occasion when, of course, he was a non-smoker and he was a non-drinker, and when she was growing up, she wanted to smoke, and she did from time to time, and she once walked into the house with a cigarette in her mouth, and her father became very angry, and said something. I can't find it easily. Said something to the effect that I'm not going to live in this house with anyone who smokes. And she said, "Well, when are you leaving?" That's it. It's more accurately put there. I'm finding it. I'm really finding it hard. One of the things, to answer questions like that, one of the things which I'm experiencing now that the book is out, after so long, it's been like an albatross around my neck, and I've lived with this for, about, I suppose, nearly a fifth of my adult life. and I want to put it aside, and I don't want to think about it much more. I think that's a fairly typical reaction. I think Dr. Tregensen would understand that. Many writers, if not most writers, never want to look again at the book they've written last year or 5 years ago. They can't. They're just so glad to have it done. I don't know whether that's typical, but I suspect it is. And so I'm finding it hard to recall off the cuff detail. So that. He was a bit of a, well, of course he was an absentee father for much of the time. Was he a softer man, this lady wants to know, than he was outside? I'm not sure that he was softer. He didn't give his family, like many politicians, perhaps most, enough time because he was so busy. The premiership in particular is such an enormously demanding job. And the children tended to feel they had an absentee father, and it was left to Lady Playford to bring them up in their childhood. He was a hard man when crossed. As I said, he didn't like to lose, and he was a bad loser, and he was a bully to his parliamentary colleagues if they threatened to step out of line. And yet he had tremendous natural gifts of leadership. There were unattractive features about him, yes, and these are dealt with. But I couldn't be confident of answering that question one way or the other, although I think you'll find many hints as to the answer in the book. Well, there wasn't a need in those days for the great funds that are needed today, and partly because there was no television. And the demands of the party in funds were met by, as I understand it, by heavy donations, not perhaps heavy donations, but large donations from the rich pastoralists and men of commerce, like the Haywoods and so on. And for the rest, of course, there were in those days the backbone of the fundraising of the Liberal Party, or its predecessor, the LCL, was the women. In those days, a minority of women went out to work, and there were plenty of women available to walk up and down the street and collect money for the party and enrol members. The membership fees were very low, probably not more than 2 or 3 shillings, and women would go out and collect dues and enrol members, and it brought in quite a lot of money. In those days, at the peak, I think there was something like 50,000 members of the Liberal Party. My belief is that there are only about 7,000 or 8,000 financial members today, and I think it's even fewer in the case of the Labour Party. Women go out to work. They don't concern themselves. They haven't the time to concern themselves with that basic fundraising. I don't know what Playford's attitude was to personal fundraising other than those I've mentioned, but I would be astounded if there were ever any hanky-panky involved. And what was your other question, your first one? Oh, his relationship with the party, yes. Well, well, no, I didn't, because the party documents were terribly formal, and you see, this was part of the dreariness of my earlier research. The records are in the Public Records Office now, but they weren't kept in an organised way. They weren't indexed and catalogued. It was an awful business, and I eventually got very little from the party records, and I don't believe that they were of any great substance. They were formal. But I'm looking at the moment for a comment which might reveal the attitude of Playford to the party. Of course, he built a tremendous domination over them, and this was very well expressed by Hurtle Morford. If I can find the thing, 1, 2, and 4. Yes, here we are. Eventually, no one could or would stand against the Premier. Hurtle Morford, an old money establishment figure who served a term as president of the LCL, reflected in retirement in 1989, "Why didn't we discipline the man? In my time, the thought of trying to discipline Tom Playford never entered any member of the party's mind. It was unthinkable that anyone could discipline him. On price control, for instance, he would every year monotonously at annual meetings or the annual convention or meeting of the Liberal Party would be held, and resolution after resolution demanding that the government end price control would be submitted to the party and carried unanimously. Some of you here may remember that. And Tom Playford would get up at the end and say, "Thank you very much. I've noted carefully your resolution on the subject of price control, and the government will, I promise you, give most careful consideration to it." And you know, nothing was ever done about it. And next year the same resolution would be submitted, and again the same result. He got to the stage where he made most of the policy himself. He ignored what the party wanted him to do for much of the time, and the party was complacently happy about the way in which he kept them in office, and that was one of the problems, because they did become very complacent, and it was a great shock to them when they went out of office, and the results haven't been too good for the Liberal Party since. Jennifer. Oh yes, Collier Cudmore. Collier Cudmore was one of the arch conservatives of the Liberal Party, and he opposed the Playford nationalisation of the Adelaide Electric Supply Company, bitterly opposed it, and was unsuccessful in the end. One day he had an overseas guest whom he was entertaining at lunch at the Adelaide Club, and they walked over to the window. They're looking out across the street, and the guest said, "What's that?" pointing to Parliament House. And Cudmore said, "That's Parliament House. That's where that bloody Bolshevik Playford operates." Oh, no, don't inflict anything more on me. I couldn't face it again. Anything more will be only a fragment, I'm afraid.
Can I just take up that Bolshevik joke? I've recently been going through some company minutes from the 1940s. A company concerned wanted to acquire some land from the Housing Trust, and they approached the Housing Trust and were knocked back. They then approached their local member, Mr. Dunnage, who said he would see what he could do and he'd have a chat with the Attorney General. This is reported over the various monthly company meetings, and eventually it's reported back to the company board that the Attorney General has had a word with Mr. Dunnage and reports that he has had a chat with Mr. Playford, and he believes that a positive response will be forthcoming from the Housing Trust. Now that makes him sound
benevolent despot.
But he is nonetheless a despot. So where do you place him in parliamentary democracy in South Australia?
Well, I don't know that he was, in fact, Don Dunstan, of course, would never concede for a moment that he was a Democrat. And yet even Dunstan is kindly. His comments about Playford, not about his manipulation of the electoral system, but in many other respects. In fact, he specifically talks about his personal kindliness. Look, Playford was a one-off. They come like that only once in 100 years. And Power, I'm bound to say, did not in the conventional sense appear to corrupt him. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, so Acton said, but Playford was not corrupted in the conventional sense. But by golly, he ran the state to an extent which it's difficult to reconcile with principles of democracy, and you and I would perhaps understand them. That's my view anyway.